Mm-hmm. Chapter 17. The murderer strikes again. The following morning, I decided to leave the island and rejoin Henry. I knew from his letters that he was anxious to see me and continue our travels together. But before I left, there was one disagreeable task I had to perform. I had to pack up my medical instruments and clean up the laboratory. When I opened the door, the scene in that hateful room filled me with disgust. The remains of the partly finished creature lay scattered on the floor. I couldn't leave them there to be found by any island people who might come by. They would surely be horrified, and then suspicious of what I was doing there. So, after washing and packing away all my instruments, I gathered the body parts and tossed them into a large suitcase. I then took the suitcase down to the beach and added some heavy stones to weigh the whole thing down. I fastened the lid, then hid the suitcase in a thick clump of bushes. I stayed in my hut until night fell. Then I returned to the beach and loaded the suitcase into my little skiff. As I sailed out a few miles from shore, I saw several fishing boats heading in towards the island. The men recognized me and waved, but I steered away from them and from the island. I waited until the bright moon was hidden by a thick cloud, and under the cover of a moment of darkness, I tossed the suitcase into the sea. As the suitcase gurgled and sank, I felt a new calm come over me. This calm, combined with the gentle rocking of the sea, made me so relaxed that I fell asleep. I slept soundly all night. It wasn't until the following morning, when the sun was high in the sky, that I finally awakened. A strong wind was blowing, and the waves were pounding hard against my little skiff. I realized that while I'd been asleep, the wind had blown my boat far from the island where I lived. I was nowhere near any land, and I feared probably somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean. The hours passed, and by late afternoon, the sea became very rough. I was beginning to suffer from thirst and from the heat, and from the fear that I would die here in the middle of the ocean, either by drowning or from starvation. Just when daylight was beginning to fade, I spied some land to the south. My one sail wasn't strong enough for me to maneuver the boat, so I made a second sail from my shirt and eagerly steered toward the small town that appeared to have a good harbor. I was busy tying up the boat when several townspeople came to me and crowded around me. I was surprised that no one offered to help me, since I was exhausted, ragged, and dried out from the sun. Instead, they began whispering to each other. Puzzled at their behavior, I called out, "Good people, would you be so kind to tell me where I am?" A fisherman stepped forward. "You'll know soon enough," he said harshly. "You may not like this place, but no one here really will care if you do or you don't." I was surprised at such rudeness from strangers, but I became more concerned when I saw angry frowns on every face in the crowd. I hardly expected Englishmen to greet strangers in such an unfriendly way. I told them as much. "I don't know much about the way the English greet strangers," said the man, "but you're in Ireland now, and we Irish hate villains." Ah, Ireland. "Villains," I gasped. "What do you mean? I haven't done anything villainous." "That's not for us to decide. You better come with us to Mr. Kerwin, our town judge. He'll want to question you about the murder of a gentleman here last night." I was puzzled, but very certain that I could explain how I wasn't involved in any murder that took place here. So although I was exhausted and hungry, I put my shirt back on and followed the crowd to Mr. Kerwin's house. Little did I know the horror that was about to overwhelm me. Mr. Kerwin was a kindly old man who seemed fair as he questioned the crowd that led me to his house. The fisherman spoke first. "I was out in my boat last night, sir, with my son. When the wind began to blow too strong, we pulled into shore. As we were beaching our boat, I struck my foot against something hard. By the light of the lantern, I saw that it was a body, a handsome young man. I'd say about 25 years old. His body was still warm, so we weren't sure if he was dead or just unconscious. We carried him to a nearby house and tried to revive him, but it was no use. He was dead. At first, I figured he'd drowned and that his body had been washed up on shore. But then we realized that his clothes were dry, so he hadn't been in the water. Then, when we saw black finger marks on his neck, we knew he'd been strangled. I hadn't paid much attention to the man's story at first, but when he told me of the finger marks on the man's neck, I felt my blood run cold. My hands began to tremble and my legs collapsed under me. I had to clutch it at a chair to keep from falling. The gentleman looked at me strangely, but then turned his attention to a woman in the crowd and asked what she knew. The woman explained, "You know, sir, I live near the beach. A while before I heard about the murder, I saw a man in a boat push off from that part of the shore where the body was found, but I didn't recognize him." Turning to me, Mr. Kerwin said, "Since you were found on the shore with a boat, it will be necessary for you to come with me to see the body." I figured he wanted to see how I would react to a body since I'd become so upset when the fisherman described the finger marks on the man's throat. So I followed the man and a few of the other men to the village inn. We made our way to a bare back room that was empty except for a plain wooden coffin in the center. Then came the terrible moment. A moment almost too terrible to talk about, even now without shuddering in agony. For as I was led up to the coffin to see the lifeless body inside, I cried out in horror. The lifeless body stretched out before me was Henry Clerval. I gasped for breath and threw myself on his cold body. Sobs tore from my chest as I cried. "Have my evil schemes killed you too, my dear friend? I've already been responsible for the deaths of 2 others. How many more victims will that demon claim as he claimed you? Henry, my lifelong friend." I couldn't continue. My body began to convulse in agony, and I slumped to the floor, unconscious. Chapter 18. Imprisoned for murder. I spent the next 2 months in prison, delirious with fever and very near death. Mr. Kerwin later told me that my ranting and raving made no sense to the jailers, who heard me and were convinced I was insane. I continually accused myself of murdering my brother, my friend Justine, and now Henry. I kept begging everyone around me to help me destroy someone I called the Fiend. I often had nightmares, during which I would scream in terror, and the Fiend's fingers were on my neck, strangling me. When the fever left me, I regained my sanity. I found myself in a wretched cell with barred windows. An old woman was asleep in a chair beside my bed. "Who are you?" I asked, waking her. "I was hired to help you get well," she snapped. "Although I don't know why you'd want to get well. Not when they're done punishing you for the man they say you murdered." I turned away from this unfeeling woman, but then realized that no one would care much about our murderer, except perhaps the hangman, who would get paid for hanging me. I soon learned, however, that Mr. Kerwin had been very kind to me during my illness. He'd sent a doctor to treat me and a nurse to care for me. He came to see me often, although it was difficult for him to listen to the ravings of someone he considered a murderer. One day, when I was strong enough to sit up in a chair, Mr. Kerwin entered my cell. Pulling up a chair next to mine, he asked, "Is there anything you need to make you more comfortable?" I looked into his kind, sympathetic eyes and replied, "I thank you, sir, but only death can make me comfortable. Only death can free me from my misery. Don't lose hope, my boy. From papers I found in your pocket, I learned who you are and who your family is in Geneva." I began to tremble at the mention of my family. "Good God," I grasped. "Has anything happened to them? Have there been another murder?" "Your family as well," Mr. Kerwin assured me, then added with a smile, "And you have a visitor here to see you." I feared the worst. The fiend was here to torture me with a story of Henry's murder. I covered my eyes and cried out, "No! Take him away! Don't let him come in!" Mr. Kerwin stood up and stared down at me in shock. "Perhaps you are guilty after all, Victor. I should think that seeing your father would please you." "My father?" I cried. Mr. Kerwin then went to the door and led my father into my cell. My joy at seeing him was surpassed only by his reassurances that Elizabeth and Ernest were also well. Besides, I was still so weak, he couldn't stay long to visit. During the next month, Mr. Kerwin and my father gathered evidence from the peasants at Orkney Island proving that I was there, not in Ireland, the night that Henry was murdered. As a result, the charges against me were dismissed, and I was released from prison. I knew I had to return to Geneva immediately to protect the people I loved and to destroy the monster I created. My father was concerned about me making such a long trip so soon after my illness. I was still a shattered wreck. My strength was gone. My body was nothing more than a skeleton, and I still suffered from fits of fever. But I was so insistent on leaving Ireland and returning to Geneva that my father finally agreed. He had heard my strange sounding ravings many times during his month with me in Ireland, and even though he attributed them to my fever, he was puzzled why I continually accused myself of the murders of William, Justine, and Henry. "My dear son," he told me, "I beg you not to ever make such accusations again. You are not responsible for these terrible deaths." I remained silent, not wishing to burden my father with my tale of horror, although I wished more than anything in the world to be able to confide my secret to another human being. All right, that's it. Next time, chapter 1920, and then 2021, we are done with Frankenstein. Stay tuned to see what happens.